Well, thank you, sir. I'm Tom Spoehr, Director of PA&E since about January of 12. Joe Martz, my predecessor, kind of high-fived me on the way out the door, said this is going to be a piece of cake, and I've been living the dream ever since. I'd like to, we'll talk a little bit about fiscal year 13, but I'm going to kind of orient most of my talk on the years past 13, because I know you had a discussion at breakfast, and there's been a lot of hallway discussion about what's going on in fiscal year 13. As you can imagine, we're doing a lot of what-if drills in the Pentagon. We're doing what-if drills on top of what-if drills, and the folks there are so confused they can't even tell what the reality is in terms of what's real and what is a what-if drill. And so we have to kind of have a paragraph 1 situation before we start any kind of discussion in the Pentagon. Next slide, please. So our agenda, fiscal year 13, we'll talk about that, then 14, and then we'll just kind of talk in broader terms about what's going on in terms of spending. Next chart, please. So as you look at the Secretary of the Army's priorities, those are listed on the bottom left of this chart. These are the things that he has set out in November and says that are important to him to do. And then you can see on the right side of the chart those things which are complicating matters. And we have the trifecta, if you will, of sequestration, the effects of the continuing resolution, and then we have shortfalls and our Overseas Contingency Operations Accounts, or OCO. Each one of those, individually, they would prove a challenge. Together, they're disastrous. And so you can see all those things. And finally, at the bottom, the Chief and the Secretary are committed to protecting those soldiers that are operating overseas in Afghanistan. So the requirement that we have to protect those folks so that they don't have to worry about money means that the effects of these shortages are disproportionately felt by the rest of our Army. The debt ceiling is out there, but frankly, that's not even on the top 3 list of things that we need to worry about. Next chart, please. So I'm not certain if this chart is legible in the back, but this is the chart that the Chief of Staff in the Army and the Secretary have been using to describe our current fiscal dilemma. Now, sequestration and other things, they are impacting our research, development, and acquisition accounts. They are impacting our military construction accounts. But where this problem is most central is in our operations and maintenance accounts, primarily Operation and Maintenance Army, or we call it OMA. And so I'm going to use a pointer here just to show you where we are here. You hear a lot about the $18 billion shortfall, and there it is. It's about $5 to $7 billion that we are short in our overseas contingency accounts, and these are things that fund food for the folks over there. They fund the contract logistical support that keeps our drones flying and keeps our aerostats up in the air and manned. Sequestration, the number is about $5.3 billion that it would take out of our OMA accounts, and that's that piece of the $18 billion. And then because of the way the continuing resolution is imposed, we're short about $6 billion in our OMA accounts because of the difference between fiscal year 12 and fiscal year 13. So what are the impacts? The cumulative impacts of this are that about 78% of our Army forces will experience a readiness decline as we go further and further into fiscal year 13. Maintenance, all kinds of maintenance will have fairly significant impacts. Maintenance on our facilities, maintenance on our equipment, maintenance on our installations of all kinds of commodities. You'll begin to see impacts in those things. And then there's the very personal impacts on our civilian workforce. We've talked about furloughs. The Secretary of Defense is holding the approval authority for furloughs to himself. And so there has been no decision on civilian furloughs. But if it takes place, it'll impact about 250,000 Army civilians. And we've talked about requiring them to take 22 days off, which would be potentially 1 day a week for the last 22 weeks of this fiscal year. You have seen probably some writings in journals and whatever about folks that say, oh, the Army, this isn't so bad. The Army's making this much worse than it might seem. And the Army has many other options that they could use to mitigate these impacts. And I would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that in my opinion, they have not taken the personal effort to educate themselves on what this is doing, because this has been a deliberate impact, and this reflects, after everybody has tried to mitigate these impacts, this is not a gold watch. This is a fairly frank assessment of what will happen when you take $18 billion away from an Army that is this far into the fiscal year. I think today or yesterday we released a series of charts which reflected state-by-state impacts of what all three of these fiscal uncertainties, if you will, would have on the Army. And the rough order of magnitude is over 350,000 civilians are impacted. Either they're laid off as a term or a temp employee, they're furloughed, or there's been an impact in the private sector, a direct industrial impact that probably you folks could speak to much articulately than I could, and about $15 billion worth of direct economic impact just in fiscal year 13 alone. And so we have a state-by-state chart. I don't know if you've seen, some of you I know, as I was going through the booths downstairs, showed me and said, hey, my factory is not reflected on your chart, and I apologize for that. We did the best we could with the time available, but we have provided state-by-state impact charts to the congressional folks from every one of those states, showing them what the impact would be of this cumulative financial uncertainty. Next chart, please. I'd like to step back now for a moment. Let's talk about federal spending over time. The chart that you see up there reflects federal budgets, not DOD budgets, federal budgets going back as far as 1962 and then fast forwarding to the estimates of fiscal year 17. And the dark blue, if you can't read the label, is what we call defense discretionary spending. And you can see what happens over time to the amount of money that the federal budget allocates to defense discretionary. It is perhaps the biggest factor that has changed in federal budgets as we go forward. And you can see the amount of money dedicated to mandatory programs continuing to rise. Non-defense discretionary, State Department, other federal agencies, has remained relatively constant, come down a little bit, but the proportional change that you see in defense discretionary spending continues to go down, and frankly, I see nothing on the horizon that's going to alter this particular behavior. Next chart, please. Again, we're still at the Department of Defense level. This is a look of the Department of Defense's budget in constant dollars over time, and you can see the rise, the ebb and the flow, if you will, of Department of Defense spending. Going back from each of the major conflicts that our country has fought, there has been a concurrent downturn, and now the question is, what's going to happen after this right here? We have projected out years in terms of our base spending. This higher level is our OCO spending, and then there's a notional sequestration level of spending on that chart as well. If you're a critic of the Department of Defense, if your priorities do not lie in national defense, you could argue, as many have, well, DOD, you have further to go. Because if you look across the chart, and I apologize, you'll see that after many of these previous conflicts, the Department of Defense has retreated back to about $400 billion of constant dollar spending. And I'll talk to you in a little bit about why $400 billion no longer works for the Department of Defense. Next chart, please. So we're pulling back the covers now on that Department of Defense spending, and this shows you the service breakout of spending as well as what we call defense-wide accounts, which doesn't neatly fit in any one of the services. And you can see how the services have fared over time. Air Force on top, dark black or blue is Navy, green Army, and then the rise of the purple, we call it in the Pentagon, and that is this purple wedge that's creeping up at the bottom. And again, that is going to continue to grow, ladies and gentlemen, and put pressure on all the services. Now, many of those things are very much needed. So, for example, our Defense Health Program is inside that. And then all the defense agencies are in there. DLA, DIA, DSCA, all those type of agencies are in that defense-wide account, if you will. But it continues to grow and will probably not slow its growth as well. And so you can see where pressure is coming both from the federal side and within the Department of Defense. We're getting pressured from all sides, if you will. Next chart, please. So now we're at the Army, and this is Army spending over time, constant dollars, going back all the way to 1948. And you can see that we mirror that same kind of trough and valley spending that has typified DOD spending. But it's even more pronounced in the Army because we are carrying the burden of current operations. And so you can see in 2008, the Army budget was at an all-time high of $275 billion. We're currently projecting it going down to about $129 billion, and these are fiscal year 13 dollars. We've depicted a notional sequestration line on there. That's just notional. No one's given us those numbers, but we're just trying to do some planning. And so, again, critics of the Army, in fact, have said, well, Army, this level of funding that sequestration poses, shoot, you had about that kind of money in constant dollars in 2002, and again back in 82. So why can't you make that work again? And again, I'll talk to you about that. But this precipitous decline, 53% of our total obligation authority going down, would pose a challenge to the most nimble of organizations to reorganize themselves, to adapt themselves to a deal with that amount of money in such a short time would pose a challenge for any organization. And I would cause you to, or we talked earlier today about Task Force Smith and the precipitous decline in money that followed the Korean War. You can see that we're going down roughly that same amount of money that the Army went down after the Korean War. Next chart, please. Finally, a very close look at Army funding over time based on our fiscal year 13 budget submission. What I want to point out to you is that something that's often lost in the the current scuffle, is that under Phase 1 of the Budget Control Act, or the BCA, this was the Army's previous level of funding, that green line that you can see there, where the Army had a total obligation authority of about $150 billion. Phase 1 of the Budget Control Act took out $487 or $89 billion over 10 years and brought the Army and the other services down to the reduced level of funding that you see now in the yellow bars. And the drop in the end strength of the Army, both in the National Guard and in the active force, and to some degree the Army Reserve and our civilians, is as a consequence of that initial cut. And so all these, you're going to hear soon about Army reorganization and which installations and which brigades are staying and which ones are not. That's all as a function of that cut that was made 2 years ago. Again, we've put a notional line of sequestration on this particular chart. In fiscal year 13, as was alluded to earlier, the cuts in 13 are prescriptive. They're down to the program, project, and appropriation level. There's very little discretion on how they're applied. In fiscal years 14 and out, it's completely up to the discretion of the Secretary of Defense as to how he allocates the money, and then obviously the President and Congress about how they approve it. But from here on out, there is no fair share of the sequestration. It's however that the administration chooses to allocate it, and that's important. General Odierno recently has testified and has made statements that if sequestration were to take effect, that these end strength cuts, which roughly order about 88,000 soldiers, would at least double if sequestration was to take effect. And that's, I think, probably a conservative estimate. In order to stay in balance, to ensure that our RDA accounts and our readiness accounts and all these other accounts are sufficient to take care of our force structure, you have to proportionally bring down force structure, and that's probably a statement of the obvious. Next chart, please. So, just some thoughts. Why? We've talked about downturns, we've talked about ebbs and flows. Maybe they were all hard, but why is this particular downturn so hard? We're still engaged in conflict. You can look at that previous chart that talked about when the money started to go down. That was after the conflict had ended. There's still 50,000 plus soldiers and service members engaged overseas. I think General Walker mentioned that there's no real peace dividend on the horizon. So you don't open the newspaper and peace is not breaking out all over the world. In fact, just the opposite. It's just a new thing every day is popping up. The scope. You know, when we reduced money at these earlier conflicts, we were a bigger army. Now we're almost the smallest army we've been. We're at 490. I think we've been at 482, but But by and large, there's not this giant standing Army that now needs to be reduced, and so you can concurrently reduce the money associated with it. The Army is already in a fairly small posture. We didn't modernize across the force, and so the same great Abrams, Bradleys, Apaches, Blackhawks that we started 12 years ago are essentially the same. We've modernized, we've put some new components inside them, but the same platform. So we don't emerge from this period of 12 years with an entire new fleet of equipment that can sustain us over a long haul. And then finally, we've talked about the multiple pressures. Now, I put a sobering statement on there in that we seek to avoid a hollow Army, but you know, as we look at history, it has been very difficult to avoid hollowing out the force in the immediate years following a budget downturn. And hollowing means that you've got force structure, but you don't have enough good equipment for it, or you don't have enough dollars to keep it trained at the level you want it. And so that is a very difficult balancing act to keep that in balance. And so as you are faced with an immediate reduction in money, it's very difficult because you can't reduce your force structure immediately. There's almost no alternative for you except to go into your operations accounts or your research, development, and acquisition accounts and take those and hopefully buy down your force structure, and so you can get the pools of water back in balance again. Chief and the Secretary are committed to avoiding a hollow force, and so, but I'll just tell you, it has been difficult when you look at the Army experiences in the past. Next chart, please. And so I've alluded to this, but why is it so hard to get, why can't the Army and the other services subsist on the same level of funding that we had back in 2000? And the dollars on these charts are constant dollars. We had a little bit of a bigger Army in 2000. I think it says 502 on the chart. But why can't we fit easily within the same amount of money that we had back in 2000? And I would offer two thoughts for you, but there is no quick answer. This one is, the Army that we have today has become very effective, and I liken it to a NASCAR pit crew. So when the NASCAR car pulls in, there's a guy that takes off every single wheel, there's a guy that jacks it up, there's a guy that does this, there's a guy that does that. Is that very efficient? Well, heck no. To be efficient, you'd have one guy, and he would do all that work, and he'd walk around the car. But we have built a very, very effective Army, but it isn't terribly efficient today. And so we're going to have to change that paradigm. But again, those type of changes do not take place very quickly. And then you can see what has changed. And we've broken out our major commodities of organization of the Army, and the biggest substantial change is in the manning area. And so the number of soldiers being paid is slightly different. It's 502 versus 482. But nevertheless, there has been real growth, and for good reasons. The Congress, the President, have approved pay raises for soldiers. They have reduced the BAH, or the Basic Allowance for Housing, so that soldiers don't have to pay any of that cost for housing out of pocket. The privatized housing initiative has built great facilities for us, but now even soldiers that are on installations pay BAH. And so our take rate, if you will, the amount of people taking BAH is much higher than it's been in the past. And these are all for good reasons. The soldiers deserve the pay, and so this is all appropriate. But this is why it will be very difficult to return a similar-sized Army to the same amount of money that we had back in 2000. Next chart, please. So just a picture, if you will. This is a graphic portrayal of the Army's budget over time as it looked in the fiscal year budget cutoff. And this is over a 5-year period. And you can see the predominant effect that active component manpower, and to some degree reserve component full-time support and health care plays on the Army budget. And so as I go to the meetings of the PA&Es and we talk about pay raises and things like that, they all look at me in sympathy, because they realize that even a small fraction of a difference in a manpower account has a very correspondingly disproportionate impact on the Army, who has really leveraged, people and soldiers are our business. And this chart shows that we have invested in our people. And so any time that changes, The folks that are around the perimeter on this chart, for example, equipping or installations, normally get squeezed a little bit. Next chart, please. My final chart, ladies and gentlemen, Army buying power. I should have mentioned it on the Army slide that we don't have enough projected finances to keep pace with inflation currently. I think inflation is like 1.6 or something like that. The Army Total Obligation Authority over time is not growing at a rate commensurate with inflation. So just that alone is going to put pressure within the Army. And so Army buying power goes down precipitously with sequestration, but even without sequestration, the Army is losing buying power. We've made some fundamental changes for our Army, all for the better, but they're going to preclude taking a similarly sized Army back to pre-war levels of funding without some very fundamental changes in the way we do business. But I would tell you that the Army leadership, Secretary McHugh, General Odierno, the Vice, the Under, they get all this. They are engaged in this. This is job number one for them, and they are as savvy or even more savvy than I am on these budget numbers. And I hate that it has to be that way. I hate that our leadership has to be so engaged in keeping track of stuff like this, but those are the times in which we live. And so I'd be delighted at this point to take any questions you might have. No questions? Thank you.